February 19th, 2016, Bellator 149. A fight that should have been a celebration of backyard brawling turned into a national embarrassment. That night, inside the cage, one fighter stopped breathing. His heart just gave out. Now, not from a knockout, and not from some devastating punch. Just pure exhaustion. And it was so bad, so reckless, that people started questioning if Bellator even cared about fighter safety at all. And honestly, it's hard to argue that they did. And it wasn't like this was a fight on the prelim that no one watched. This was one of the most hyped fights in Bellator history. It was the co-main event of their pay-per-view, a showdown between two absolute street fighting legends, Kimbo Slice and Dada 5000. These two guys who went from knocking dudes out in backyards for internet fame to headlining an actual professional MMA event. It was supposed to be wild, supposed to be a spectacle, and it was, just not for the reasons that anyone expected. By the end of the night, one man was in the hospital fighting for his life. The other wouldn't live to see the end of the year, while Bellator walked away from the whole mess like it was just another Friday night. This is the story of Bellator 149, a fight so bad it damn near killed two men, and no one wants to talk about it. Alright, let's back up for a second, because to understand why Bellator 149 turned into a disaster, you have to understand how we even got here. And it all starts with two things: desperation and nostalgia. See, back in 2016, Bellator was in a weird spot. They were the number 2 MMA promotion in the world, but let's be real, a very distant number 2. They were not pulling UFC numbers, and at this point the UFC was on fire. Conor McGregor had just knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds. Ronda Rousey was still a megastar, even after getting her head kicked off by Holly Holm. MMA was mainstream, and UFC was king. Meanwhile, Bellator, man, they were just struggling to keep up. Their solution, they'd think of, was go full freak show mode. Bring back old school names, throw them in the cage, and hope that nostalgia sells. And I'm not gonna lie, it kinda worked. They had Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock for the third time, even though both of them should have been retired for good. They booked Tito Ortiz versus Stephan Bonner and hyped it up like it was UFC 100. And when they needed another headliner, they turned to a rivalry straight out of the YouTube backyard fighting days: Kimbo Slice versus Dada 5000. Now, if you don't know who these guys are, let me introduce them to you. Kimbo Slice, he was the original internet street fighting legend. Before UFC, before Bellator, this dude was out here throwing hands in backyards and back alleys, knocking dudes out in parking lots while guys screamed "World Star" behind a flip phone. He was a celebrity before he ever even stepped foot in a real cage. And Dada 5000? He was his rival, another Miami backyard brawler who ran his own underground fighting circuit. Same vibe, no gloves, no rules, just straight up backyard violence.
Kimbo Slice was a tough guy and he was a fun guy to watch, but the reality of what he represented as a mixed martial arts fighter, he was fairly novice. He was a good puncher who was really good in those backyard brawls.
Sure.
Like, in those environments, he was tougher than 99% of the guys out there.
So when Bellator announced this fight, people went nuts. This was a real beef. Dada and Kimbo had history. Bad blood from their backyard fighting days, from Miami's underground fight scene. This didn't feel like a fabricated rivalry. This felt like gang warfare that was to be settled in the cage. But here's the problem. These guys were not in their prime anymore, and they sure as hell weren't ready for an actual sanctioned MMA fight. Dada hadn't fought in years, and when he did, he wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. And Kimbo was 42 years old. His last fight was so bad that he got busted for steroids afterward. But Bellator didn't care. They saw the headlines, they saw the nostalgia factor, and they booked the fight anyway. And here is where it gets really bad. Dada 5000 wasn't even close to being in fighting shape. His walk-around weight was way above the heavyweight limit. When Bellator told him that he had to cut down to 265 for the fight, he basically had to starve himself in order to make weight. Now, rapid dehydration like this drastically reduces blood plasma volume, increasing the risk of kidney failure, cardiac arrest, and severe fatigue. When the body loses too much fluid too quickly, the heart has to work significantly harder to pump blood, leading to catastrophic consequences. The crazy part is the Texas State Athletic Commission, the people who are supposed to protect the fighters, let it all happen. No serious medical tests, no extra precautions, just, yeah, you look fine, go fight. Which, spoiler alert, he wasn't fine, not even close. So now you've got two guys way past their prime, one of them borderline dying from a weight cut, stepping into a cage for a fight that never should have happened. And the promotion was selling it like it was GSP versus Anderson Silva. Scott Coker, Bellator's president, even defended it, saying, "Fans want to see these two legends settle the score." Yeah, okay, Scott. Fans also wanted to see Fedor fight Randy Couture. Maybe book that. But no, they had to arrange a fight where one guy who hadn't fought in 6 years in a cage with someone who almost died making weight. But still, the fight was booked, the crowd was hyped, and the stage was set. Kimbo Slice versus Dada 5000, a fight for the history books. And oh boy, it was historical alright, just not in the way that anyone expected. That night in Houston, Texas at the Toyota Center, the crowd was absolutely buzzing. This was supposed to be a street fight, a clash of titans, the final chapter in a street fighting rivalry that had been brewing for years. And if you just looked at the build-up, the way Bellator hyped this thing, you'd think you were about to witness some legendary fight of the year type action. This was supposed to be Godzilla versus King Kong, but what we got, man, I don't even know how to describe it. Dada 5000 walks out first, and immediately the dude does not look right. He's moving slow, he's breathing heavy, and the fight hasn't even started yet. Now Kimbo walks out next, looking a little better, but let's be honest, he's 42 and his gas tank is about as reliable as a 1996 Honda with 300,000 miles on it. The bell rings, and right away, it's clear, this is gonna be bad. It was like the first bell sucked all the hype of the fight when you actually saw the shape that they were in. Now, when I say bad, I don't mean sloppy but exciting, like two guys who are just swinging for the fences. No, I mean slow motion, like somebody hit the slow-mo button on the fight and forgot to turn it off. Within 1 minute, both guys are completely exhausted, hands on the knees, gasping for air type of exhaustion. They're throwing punches at half speed. Kimbo lands a jab, and Dada reacts like he has been hit by a truck. But it's not because of the punch, it's because he can barely stand up anymore. At one point, Kimbo goes for a takedown, and it's possibly the slowest takedown attempt in MMA history. I mean, he just kinda leans into Dada, and then Dada just kind of falls over. And somehow Kimbo still doesn't have enough energy to keep him down, so they just kind of lay there sucking wind, waiting for the ref to reset them. The crowd, which was insanely hyped before the fight, starts to realize what's happening. This isn't a fight. This is two exhausted, obese men barely moving, desperately trying not to collapse from sheer fatigue. The sad part is, it was about to get way worse. Round 2, it's even uglier. Both guys are barely able to throw punches anymore. They're leaning on each other for support. At one point, Dada throws a knee, and I swear it looks like it took him 5 full seconds to lift his knee and put it back down. The commentary team tried their best with what they were given, and were trying to act like this was still a fight and not two men on the verge of passing out. Then we get to round 3, and this is where it goes from bad to terrifying. It was two men running on empty, stumbling around like exhausted marathon runners who had nothing left in the tank. Kimbo Slice could hardly lift his arms, but somehow he still had just enough left to throw some slow looping punches. They weren't fast, they weren't powerful, but Dada 5000 had absolutely nothing left to give. With about a minute left in the round, Kimbo lands a sluggish right hand. It barely connects, grazing Dada more than actually hitting him clean. But instead of dodging or even reacting properly, Dada just stumbles backward like a man who has forgotten how to control his own legs. His body is completely shutting down. His movements are slow and disoriented. Kimbo follows up with another soft punch that lands on Dada's head, and that's all it takes. Dada staggers back toward the cage, his arms flailing slightly as if he's trying to keep his balance, but his body refuses to cooperate. Then, in one of the most bizarre endings to a fight ever seen, his legs, they just simply give out. It's not a dramatic knockout, there's no head snap, no brutal impact. His body just collapses like a puppet whose strings have been cut. The ref jumps in, fight's over, Kimbo wins. But something is seriously wrong with Dada. He's not moving, he's not responding. The medical team rushes in, and suddenly the energy in the arena shifts from, what did we just watch, to, oh, this is bad. Because here's the thing, Dada didn't just lose the fight. His heart stopped beating, right there in the cage. The dude died. His body shut down from sheer exhaustion. His kidneys failed. He was seconds away from never waking up again. And if the medical team hadn't acted fast, we would be talking about a death in the Bellator cage. Meanwhile, Kimbo Slice, who was barely standing himself, has no idea how close he was to being part of the most tragic moment in MMA history. He is just standing there, hands on his knees, gasping for air, probably thinking, man, I never want to fight again. Dada is rushed to the hospital, and for one entire week he is fighting for his life. He had to be put on a ventilator to help him stay alive. His kidneys were completely shut down, so he had to undergo dialysis for a couple of months. The doctors literally tell him, your body quit on you. You weren't supposed to survive this.
Hey, has there ever been a bigger shit show than that Bellator
Never.
fight? I think it put our sport back 7 years.
Nah, just put Bellator back.
Yeah,
Didn't do shit to
free
our
agents
sport.
now are going to go Bellator? Fuck, man.
Fuck that.
How about Dada? Went to the hospital.
Yeah, his heart stopped. It was
Dada
just filled,
died.
It was filled with cheeseburgers and fried chicken and
Dude,
orange soda.
Hey, is there any way you could have trained for that fight? Is
He
there
didn't train.
any way?
There's no way he trained.
No way. He thought he was just hood.
I mean, he might have trained for a couple of days.
They said he lost 40 pounds.
Well, that's not good. You should have lost 40 pounds before.
Dude,
it's not like you didn't know
you
you were
don't do
gonna
that in the
this.
backyards.
Well, how about Kimbo? What the fuck was going on with him? That wasn't even amateur hours, because you really, if it's an amateur fight, like, you would be like chomping at the bit to get at those guys. But I hope they're in my bracket. Like,
Fuck
all you
yeah.
have to do is dance around for a few minutes. These guys are toast.
I agree.
A low-level college wrestler would have fucked those dudes
Oh,
up.
but how about this
Fuck
one
the
exchange?
college wrestler.
How about
High
the one
school.
exchange?
But at least we found out that Kimbo was the better fighter since he won the fight, right? Well, about that. Kimbo's win was turned into a no contest. He gets busted for steroids. Again. And then to make matters worse, he suffers heart failure of his own. And unfortunately, he didn't make it. He passed away in June of 2016. An absolute tragedy. So now Bellator has a dead fighter, another one barely clinging to life, and the worst, ugliest fight in MMA history on their hands. And you'd think that after all of this, they'd at least admit they screwed up, right? Yeah, no. They just kind of moved on like nothing happened. I know this is a lot to digest, so let's take a breather here for a moment. We have just watched a fight where one guy literally died and had to be brought back to life, and the other guy tested positive for steroids and then died 4 months later from heart failure. Like, this is as bad as it gets. If this doesn't wake up a promotion and make them rethink their entire approach, what will? Well, if you're Bellator, you just pretend it never happened. Seriously, there was no big press conference, no official statement saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have booked two exhausted, out-of-shape street brawlers in a high-stakes MMA fight. Nothing. Just complete radio silence. Bellator CEO Scott Coker did a few interviews, but when reporters asked about fighter safety, he gave the classic promoter response: "We followed all the commission guidelines." Oh, so now it's the commission's fault. Now it's Texas's fault for clearing two guys who could barely pass a fitness test at your local gym. And speaking of the Texas Commission, they deserve just as much blame. Because let's be real, this fight never should have been approved. For high-risk fighters, guys that are over 40, or guys cutting extreme amounts of weight, most top commissions like Nevada and New York require additional medical testing. We're talking EKGs to check for rhythm abnormalities, echoes to look for heart enlargement, which is very common in athletes, stress tests to see how the heart responds under exertion, and comprehensive metabolic panels to monitor kidney and liver function, especially for extreme weight cuts. But in Texas, they didn't require any of that. Kimbo was 42 and had already failed a drug test before. Dada had cut 40 pounds in 3 weeks and looked like he was on the verge of collapse before he even stepped in the cage. And yet Texas waved them through. No extra tests, no questions asked, just sign the paperwork and let the freak show continue. And here's the worst part. This wasn't even the first time that Texas let something like this happen. Remember when Ken Shamrock fought Kimbo in 2015? That fight also happened in Texas. Shamrock was 51 years old, and he got knocked out in a fight that looked more scripted than an episode of WWE Raw. And guess what? Kimbo failed a drug test after that fight too. But Texas just kept signing off on these fights like they were handing out driver's licenses. Now, in any normal sport, if something this bad happened, the organization would take action, right? Like, imagine if an NFL player collapsed on the field and went into cardiac arrest. There would be huge investigations. Rules would change overnight. Player safety would be the #1 topic on every sports show. But Bellator just kept doing business as usual. No public apology, no statement saying, hey, we need to take fighter safety more seriously. Nothing. It was just, well, that was crazy. Anyways, on to the next event. And that's what makes this so frustrating, because the UFC, whether you love them or hate them, actually learned from their mistakes. After 2016, the UFC started cracking down hard on weight cutting. They added early weigh-ins to give fighters more time to recover. They pushed for stricter medical exams. And you know what? It's not perfect, but it's way better than what Bellator was doing. Bellator, on the other hand, they just kept booking the same freak show fights over and over again. A few months later, they had Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie 3, 2 guys in their 50s. It was embarrassing. And look, I get it. Bellator was trying to compete with the UFC, and they thought that putting on these wild, nostalgia-based fights would bring in casual fans. But at what cost? Because after Bellator 149, one thing was crystal clear. They didn't care about fighter safety at all. Now let's play a little what-if game. What if Bellator 149 happened under the UFC banner? What if this disaster went down at UFC 200 or UFC 205? Would Dana White just brush it off and keep booking these types of fights? I don't think he would. Now, say what you want about Dana White, he's got a lot of flaws, but the UFC actually cares about looking professional. They know that they have a real business to run. If a fighter literally died in the octagon, you better believe the UFC would go into full damage control mode. There would be new safety measures immediately. There would be press conferences, apologies, a full overhaul on how they approve fights. But Bellator, they were like, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And that is the biggest difference between the two promotions. The UFC wants to be taken seriously. Bellator just wanted views, even if it meant putting fighters' lives at risk. And that is why Bellator 149 is such a shameful moment in MMA history. Not just because the fight was terrible, not just because a man nearly died, but because nobody took responsibility. Not Bellator, not the Texas Commission, not a single person. But if we try to look for any bright side, and God knows there is very little bright side to this story, it might be what happened to Dada 5000 after the infamous night in Texas. You see, for a lot of fighters, a night like that would be the end of the road. A near-death experience, kidney failure, heart stopping twice. That is usually your cue to retire and never step in a cage again. But Dada had the streets in him, because somehow, despite literally dying that night, he found a way to bounce back. After Bellator 149, Dada was messed up. We're talking full-blown organ failure. His kidneys shut down, his heart stopped twice, and according to him, he actually had a near-death experience. Like full-on I saw the light type of moment. He later said in interviews that when he collapsed, he felt himself floating out of his body. He was gone. And then boom, he woke up in a hospital bed. Doctors told him straight up, "You're lucky to be alive. If the medical team hadn't acted immediately, he wouldn't have made it." His body had gone through absolute hell. The extreme weight cut, the exhaustion, the dehydration. It was a perfect storm of bad decisions. And the craziest part was he had no idea how bad it was until days later. He was unconscious for almost a week. Imagine that. You step into a cage thinking you're about to have the biggest fight of your life, and the next thing you know, you wake up in a hospital and someone's telling you, "Dude, you died." I mean, that's gotta mess with your head. So what do you do after something like that? Do you try to fight again? Do you go back to street fighting? Do you just fade into obscurity? Well, Dada took a different path. He started using his story as a lesson. After recovering, he went back to where it all started, Miami. And instead of getting back in the cage, he focused on something way bigger, helping the next generation avoid the same mistakes that he made. He started working more with his old backyard fighting promotion, BYB Extreme. But this time, it wasn't just about putting on fights. It was about changing the culture. He wanted to give young fighters a chance to do it the right way, without the shady weight cuts, without the sketchy commissions, without the circus acts. And honestly, that's huge, because for a lot of young guys coming up, street fighting isn't just about money, it's about survival. A lot of these dudes have nothing, no guidance, no structure, and for years, the only way out was either boxing or the streets. Dada wanted to give them a third option. Legitimate opportunities in MMA without the shady business that nearly cost him his life. After the near-tragic Bellator 149 fight that he had, Dada 5000 made sure that he took major steps with BYB Extreme to improve fighter safety. Unlike Bellator, which largely ignored the fallout, BYB prioritized stricter medical screenings, mandatory pre-fight EKGs, and hydration tests to prevent dangerous weight cuts. They also refined fight pacing and conditioning requirements, ensuring that fighters were in proper shape before stepping into the ring. Additionally, their unique triangular cage design, while built for action, was adjusted to minimize prolonged clinch situations that could lead to extreme fatigue. Yes, bare-knuckle fighting is brutal by nature, and even with the improvements, injuries still happen. There is still the risk of brain trauma, broken hands, and all the other dangers that come along with professional fighting. But the difference is accountability. When Dada 5000 collapsed in Bellator, the promotion just moved on. When Kimbo Slice passed away 4 months later, Bellator didn't change a thing. But when Dada got a second chance, he didn't ignore what happened. He built something better. He created a promotion that took the reckless energy of backyard fighting and gave it structure. Now the big question, could Dada 5000 ever fight again? Because let's be real, no matter how bad that last fight was, when a fighter retires, there's always that itch to come back. And for someone like Dada, who is just starting his pro career when everything fell apart, you know he had to wonder, what if? Well, believe it or not, he actually teased a return. A couple of years after Bellator 149, he started posting training footage again, hitting the heavy bag, talking about unfinished business, even hinting that he had offers to fight again. And here's where it gets even crazier. BYB Extreme, the bare-knuckle promotion that Dada helped build, started promoting him as a potential comeback fight. Yeah, you heard that right. Bare-knuckle boxing. The same guy whose heart stopped in an MMA fight was considering stepping into a bare-knuckle war. Just imagine how insane that would have been. But ultimately, it never happened. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Because even though Dada has that warrior mentality, his body isn't built for another run. He took too much damage. The weight cuts destroyed his health. And even he admits that he's not the same guy he used to be.
This is a miracle. They said, no, this is God. I'm on the inside. When I broke free, they was like, scrap him down, scrap him down. Well, I was back. I could have laid down and gave up. I wanted to live, and I fought. And when I powered my eyes up, everybody that I heard that said give up is, he's in the bad, I had an attitude with that.
So while the idea of a Dada 5000 comeback sounds crazy, the reality is he made the right call by staying out of the cage. So after all of this, after one of the most embarrassing fights in MMA history, after a near-death experience, after Kimbo Slice's tragic passing, did Bellator learn anything? Did they finally stop booking these circus fights? Well, kinda, but not really. After Bellator 149, they did scale back on these super obvious freak show fights. They stopped booking 50-year-old legends against each other just for nostalgia points. But make no mistake, Bellator never stopped being Bellator. They still booked old-school names to bring in views. They still prioritized spectacle over substance sometimes, and even though they started signing younger, high-level talent, they never shook off the reputation of being UFC's weird little brother. And now, Bellator doesn't even exist anymore. The company was bought out by the PFL in late 2023. So, in a way, Bellator 149 wasn't just one bad night. It was a sign of what was coming. A company that refused to evolve. A promotion that cared more about viral moments than fighter safety. And eventually, it all caught up to them. Now let's zoom out, because after everything we have talked about, Dada's near-death experience, Bellator's failure to take responsibility, did anything actually change the sport of MMA? Well, yeah, sort of. Over the last few years, we have seen some progress. PFL, for example, has a much stricter medical screening process. One Championship introduced hydration tests to prevent extreme weight cuts. And even the UFC, despite all of its flaws, has gotten way better at protecting fighters from themselves. But at the end of the day, this is still fighting. And as long as money is involved, there will always be promotions willing to push the limits for a quick payday. And that is why Dada 5000's story still matters. It's not just a crazy fight that went horribly wrong. It's a warning, a reminder of what happens when promotions stop caring about fighter safety. A reminder that no matter how tough these guys are, they're still human.